Are live on YouTube right now because for some reason or another, Facebook Live is not letting me do a live stream within the Life After Loss Academy private Facebook group. So if you'll hold tight for one moment, I'm going to share the link to this call and hopefully everybody can migrate over here to YouTube. This has never happened before, so I am a little concerned. Hold one moment for me, everybody. Okay, just posted in the group. Fingers crossed that everybody can find that okay. And I'm going to wait for a couple of people to join the room before we really start deep diving in. I cannot do surveys here on YouTube like I can on Facebook, and the comments are a little bit different. But hopefully, some of you are familiar with this format on Patreon. I do the YouTube lives every single month, and the format's really similar. So just leave your comments in the sidebar on the right. I don't believe an account is required to join. And we'll get into it. We'll talk about week 8, Embrace the New You. And thank you, God, thank you so much for your patience. I've been swearing at the computer and I've been kind of grateful that it hasn't been live because I've been dropping F bombs like crazy. This has just never happened before. And we're looking now at 1:20 p.m. Central Time. So I'll actually be staying on an additional 20 minutes today to accommodate people for our call who are on standby and who are waiting. And I know Melissa, a couple of other people emailed me earlier in the day saying that they were not able to attend the full stream. So I will post this completed video in our Life After Loss Academy course Facebook group so everyone can go back and watch it. And I'll submit a support ticket to Facebook as well, and hopefully their live will be repaired next week. I swear I tried to go live 7 different times in here, and each time it said your live broadcast could not be started. Please resume, and I'd click resume and I'd see myself, but I knew because there was no chat showing up, there was no title on the video, that it was not possible for me to have gone live. And I know a lot of you were refreshing the pages and trying to figure out where I was. Yeah, I'm here. This is a good standby, a good backup, and today we have migrated to YouTube, and I will be staying on an additional 20 minutes today to compensate for the fact that I was trying to figure this out for 20 minutes before we got on. But that's a bit of wiggle room that I have there, a little bit of grace there that I have, and I'm just going to double check on here that everybody's able to move over from Facebook to YouTube. I know it's an abrupt transition. I was not expecting this today either, but I'm hoping that this is going to prove helpful. Let's see. Do we have people here? Aaron, I see you. Phew, hi everyone. Kim, hi friends. The universe was conspiring me to allow me to participate in the whole hour. I was running late. Oh, good. Oh, good, Kim. I'm glad we've got you on here. Betty says, hello, Tammy. I'm here. So glad you were able. I'm seeing here. Thank you guys so much for moving over to YouTube with me. This is like a trusty backup, but even this, I'm like, I don't really know what's going on. And so I'm going to be submitting a help ticket to Facebook for why was I not allowed to go live in the group. I tried 7 times, then I even did the thing where I shut off my computer and turn it back on again to see if it was me. It wasn't me. It was Facebook for sure. So welcome. I'm doing like a big exhale here. Welcome to week 8 of Life After Loss Academy, which is titled Embrace the New You. And I saw from one of Kim's comments, I was also on my phone trying to respond to comments as my computer was restarting. Kim said this week was harder for me than I thought it would be. So I'm really curious about what your experience was of Embrace the New You as a week in whole, and which parts you struggled with the most, or which parts kind of resonated or clicked with you the most. Because there's a difference between acknowledging that you've changed and acknowledging that the person you are is worthy of love and embrace. So there's a difference between saying, yeah, I'm a new person, and I love this new person, or I honor this new person, or I feel close to this new person, or I welcome this new person, or I embrace this new person. There's a big difference between I have changed and I love myself despite, inclusive of the fact that I have changed. Yeah. So I'm wondering what about this week was a struggle for you? And I know that I can't run a poll here on YouTube like I traditionally can on Facebook, but I'm going to pop over to Thinkific and see what the big three themes were for this week, and I can kind of ask you some more directed questions then. Because granted, I create all of this in advance, and then I don't forget what I wrote necessarily, but at some point it all runs together. So I love knowing exactly what we're talking about when we get into it every single week together. Yeah, yeah. So glad to see some more people jumping on. Thank you for migrating over with us. This is very sudden, unexpected, but also, I don't know if any of you believe in the planetary movements. Mercury is in retrograde right now, which means technology is on the fritz. So plan ahead, give yourself extra travel time, charge all of your devices, keys, phone, wallet when you walk out the door, because this is the time where things like that get missed, fall through the cracks. And if you don't believe in stuff like that, there are a few of us who do. So if you don't mind entertaining us for a while, that's kind of nice that you do that. Yeah, absolutely. Might be my internet as well. My internet's running extremely slow today. But even so, YouTube's working, Facebook is not. Baffling. Kate says, haha, that explains so much. Yes, Mercury's in retrograde until March 3rd, I believe the day is. So watch yourselves, Life After Loss Academy students. I won't put too much stock in it, but I put just. Okay. So, Life After Loss Academy students, tell me what you're struggling the most with this week in the process of embracing the new you. Is it seeing yourself as a child, someone who's struggling or worthy of the love and acceptance that the new you really needs? Is for your new self and the person that you've become in the aftermath of loss, kind of gathering the accomplishments, the evidence, the proof that you're doing well, you've done well, and you're going to continue to do well in the future. Because I think one of the big fears that a lot of people have, especially when they're given a new self to take care of in the aftermath of loss, when this new person is kind of thrust on our doorstep and we're like, what the hell? One of the hardest things to do is realize and recognize that that person is capable of being things, accomplishing things, doing things, just not in the same way that they were previously. And so we need to change our yardsticks, our measuring sticks of how we measure ourselves as good, successful, unfailure people changes in the aftermath of loss. And in that, it's almost like we have to become our own lawyers, become our own advocates, and build a case of why we should be loving towards and embracing our new selves. Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Kim says, I struggle with feeling so much less than I was before, and then fighting with myself because I know this feeling has garbage in it. It's really hard to visualize this new self with love and compassion. That's a really good place to start because I think a lot of people are, oh gosh, they look at themselves in the mirror and they're like, I'm so much less of who I used to be. And this goes back to this idea of what is your measuring stick that you're using. And if you're measuring your new self against your old self, the answer is yes. But you are also so much more than you used to be in a lot of different ways, in ways that your old self could never have fathomed. And your new self may not see those ways as good yet, beneficial yet, helpful yet, successful yet, but there may be a time when you do. And in the meantime, you can love yourself for the pieces that you used to be that remain. I know we talked about in episode in week 4 of Life After Loss Academy, we took an identity inventory and talked about releasing our old selves and even into week 5. But there is some stuff that stays, and that stuff is still worthy of our love because we already love that piece of ourselves. So this is really about loving the entirety of the new self. Yeah, and so it is hard to look at ourselves with love. And I wonder, Kim, how did the wounded or struggling child exercise work for you? Because when I see myself, or when I saw myself in the aftermath of my loss, not as this 21-year-old girl who just moved to Chicago and was starting a job at an ad agency, but like a 5-year-old girl whose mother had just died or had been eternally separated from a source of nourishment, care, love, etc. Like when I saw her from that wounded place, instantly I was overwhelmed with, oh my God, that poor baby. And this is not, embrace the new you is not about instigating self pity or feeling sorry for ourselves, but really seeing the entirety of the way in which we've been wounded or hurt, or in talking about releasing anger and disappointment in week 7, the ways in which we've been torn from our previous lives before. And in seeing the sheer bigness, the audacity, the hugeness of that, that can incite a lot of self-love because it's like, "Oh my God, you've been through so much." And I don't know if any of us have ever really said that to ourselves. We think that because we're still standing, we're doing okay, but we never sit down and fully recognize the extent of the shit that we've been through. So I guess in addition to building a case for ourselves of all the things we've accomplished, we should also be building a counter case of, look at all the shit you've survived. Look at all the shit that you've dealt with in the past year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 12 years, and you've made it out the other side. And it's not necessarily you've survived, but you've taken quite a beating, is at the root of that. Is, holy crap, not I can't believe that you're still standing, but there's almost like this appreciation or this disbelief that you as a human are still alive and walking the planet, inclusive of the fact of all the crap that's happened to you. And so when I see myself not as the 21-year-old girl who lost her mom, but as a 5-year-old who lost her mom and was eternally separated from the source of love, caring, nourishment, comfort, mothering in the world, I'm like, oh my God. This poor child has lived through and survived so much, and she's just trying to she's so lost. She's just trying to figure out what to do with herself and what to do with her life now that the very worst thing that could have ever happened just happened. And so I gave myself a ton more compassion when I was like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to answer the phone anymore. I don't know how to read anymore. I don't know how to, gosh, feed myself anymore. I was overwhelmed with this compassion then, because instead of expecting this capable 21-year-old self to do all of these things, or even the shadow of my old self to step in and do these things, it was like I was looking at this little girl and being like, take care of yourself. And there's no way that you can yell at her. There is no way that you can yell at her without feeling like you're an absolute monster. And so all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, like, come here, let's figure out how to make lunch together. And it was a way for me to kind of stop um, yelling at myself, berating myself for not being better, or at my new self for not being my old self, and was instead a way to like group in the fact that loss had happened and the fact that I was surviving, like both of these things as evidence for myself, and be like, okay, if all of this crud just happened and all of these new things are true about me, then how are we going to navigate the world together? And so instead of pushing these things away of, oh, it wasn't so bad, it occurred over 4 or 5 years, nobody actually died, blah, 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 like all of these like logical things, and really came at it from a heart perspective of like, who is this new person? It makes sense that they're feeling lost, confused, betrayed, misunderstood, lonely. Then I was like, oh my God, of course it would be hard to remember what address you live at. Of course it would be hard to make friends in a new city. Of course it would be hard to show up for work and take notes as if nothing was wrong, or as if all of this hadn't just happened. I wonder if that's helping you at all, Kim, because it sounds like we haven't seen the new measuring stick for you yet. You're still measuring your new self up against the person that your old self was. Um, in that, and that's where that language of I am so much less than I used to be comes in. The less and the more of we're measuring something or calculating something. It's a very head logical thing that happens. I guess my question to you here is like, what if there was nothing to measure or nothing to calculate or compare against? What if your old self was your old self for all intents and purposes of being your old self? Loss happened. We talked about in week 5 and week 6 and release the old you and say goodbye to the perfect griever. It's like there's no way that you could have retained who you were and experience loss. It's just not physiologically, spiritually, emotionally, physically possible to remain our old selves and survive, live through catastrophic loss. It's just not possible. So, knowing these things to be true, I wonder if you might have more compassion for the new self, even though so much of the old self no longer exists. I'm so much less. I'm maybe 10% old self and 90% what the hell is this new stuff? And it may not be fun. Like, the whole point of this week is not for you to enjoy looking at your new self, but recognizing that she is a person that's worthy of your love, focus, attention, caretaking, um, just like believing that we're not broken, that this has not broken us. Yes, we have been broken by the experience of loss, and the old self has died, but the new self, our core selves, are the spirit of us, the things that make Tammy Tammy, Kim Kim, Melissa Melissa, those things have not died. Like, we are still here and surviving, but everything about what makes us up is really different in the aftermath of loss. I wonder if this makes sense to anybody. Melissa jumped on. Hi, everybody. And Tammy says, hi, Melissa. Yeah, so glad to have you guys here. And one of the things that I wrote down for this week in Embrace the New You is it's really, really hard to feel like we love ourselves when we're not good at it yet. I think a lot of us were really used to loving the person that our old self was. I think not only were we really used to living that life, but for most of us, we actually really liked who we were. So loving the new self is really hard to do because we feel like we don't know them. They're almost a stranger to us, and yet they are us. They are in our bodies. They have, not like aliens who've taken over, but like they are a part of us, but we didn't ask them to be here. And it's really drastically different than in the old life where we literally created who we were. We controlled, where we lived, where we worked, what we ate, how many children we had. We controlled who we got into relationships with. We controlled who our friends were. We controlled what our communities were surrounded by. And literally all of those things helped us shape our identity. And then loss happened, and so much of that fell apart. And yes, granted, maybe 5, just 10% of us stayed the same. Some of the old self was incorporated and included and like is still around. But we did not get to choose who this new self is. And for that reason, we usually resent or hate that person because all of a sudden I couldn't read. All of a sudden my energy was tanked. All of a sudden, I never went out on weekends anymore. I would just go home and sleep. And I was like, who is this lazy slob of a human? Who is this sick, horrendously weak, like, introvert hermit? Like, who the hell is that person? Because that was so not me, and I would never in a million years have chosen that life for myself. And so it was really hard to love myself at first, and on top of that, I wasn't really good at it. I loved myself in the old life because I created myself. I had power and control there. So the question is, can we continue to love ourselves when we don't control or can't control the person that we are? Can we continue to embrace ourselves and take care of ourselves and see ourselves as worthy of compassion if we did not create the circumstances that created who we are right now? That's an enormously huge question, and I get chills saying this right now. Yeah, because there's this illusion that we're really proud of ourselves when we do things that we want to do, like when we accomplish things, when we become successful at things, when we are who we think we are. We have this picture in our heads of who we're supposed to be, and then hopefully that transmits into reality. And when it does, we love ourselves a lot more. But when it doesn't, we love ourselves a lot less. And so, can we love ourselves if the picture we have in our heads of how we're supposed to be does not match up with how we are in real life? Whether the circumstances are death, divorce, diagnosis, or some kind of other loss. Melissa said, I like how you said count your daily tasks as a new accomplishment because you're doing them with grief in tow. Yeah, and I saw some really cool responses to this one. Like Mike said, I made a cup of coffee while grieving. I went to the cemetery while grieving. For me in my life, it was like I figured out how to take public transit for the first time while grieving. And that's already a confusing, disorienting process to take public transit for the first time. Hashtag raised in the suburbs my whole life. And so to figure out how to take public transit for the first time in Chicago without anybody there to guide me was enormously hard. And then tack on like a fortune cookie game while grieving to the end of it. And I was like, wow, I can't read as fast. I'm not walking as fast. I don't know which way is north or south. I need to lean on my phone for a compass and for directions quite a bit when normally I would just get on and see what happens. And there was a lot more anxiety related to it too. When the trains came roaring by, that was loud. There was a bit of trauma left over from when my mom died. And so loud noises, huge crowds of people, all these things like really shook me. And so taking public transit for the very first time while grieving was an intense toll on my body. I essentially figured out how to take the bus and take the train and took them home. I took them back home. I left my house, figured out how to take them, maybe took 2 hours, and then came back to my apartment and slept because it was so exhausting for me to do all of these things while also grieving. And you don't have to be actively like you don't have to be actively sobbing while all of these things are happening. And I think that's what people think of when they think while grieving. I'm like, no, it's just you're facing life with grief as you're doing all of these things. Um, Betty says, I'm not really hard on myself as I realize it's a wonder how I'm even surviving. Yeah. And this is something that I talked about when I spoke with Rob Bell on his podcast is this sense of wonder. And I love, Betty, that you use this word too, because sometimes I wake up and I'm like, it's a wonder that I'm even alive because I was convinced beyond all shadow of a doubt that the death of my mother would be the thing that killed me. Whether her actual death killed me and I died of like that broken heart disorder that can also follow massive loss, or I killed myself. I was convinced that this would either die or I would kill myself and I would not survive. What was really happening was the death of my old self, but it felt like a much larger death than that because it was something that was way out of my control. I would have never asked for in a million years. I had no power, um, no say. We really have no say. There's a voicelessness that comes with loss. Absolutely. Tammy says, yes, I think our identity, which has maybe been fashioned over many years, is defined by who we're married to, the community we're connected with, the role we play in the lives of our family, friends, children, etc. And maybe we've worked hard to build that in a way that creates a pretty picture. And you've stumbled on something so cool here, Tammy, because what happens is we build our lives kind of in this stretched out space, family, friends, community, marriage, relationships, blah, blah, blah. Loss rolls in, we're totally different people overnight. And it blows our minds because we're not, no one could have ever prepared us for this. You hear me like stuttering in my throat. I'm like, there's not even words for the jolt and the immediacy with which it happens. And there are some things that you lose over time with grief. There are some gradual things that you find yourself losing, but for the most part, especially in sudden traumatic or unexpected loss, these changes to yourself, to you, happen immediately. So it's like everything you've been building for the past 5, 10, 15 years comes crashing down overnight, as soon as the news comes, as soon as the loss happens, as soon as you get the call. And that we are not used to doing. We are used to building ourselves and fine tuning ourselves and figuring out who we are and kind of changing our hair color by a shade or two over years and years and years. And that's what self improvement and growth and kind of building ourselves looks like. So for loss to come through and be like, I'm just going to pummel all of that, here's your new self, is like, what the shit just happened? And so it like warrants some swearing in there. Absolutely. Erin says, this week really resonated with me. I felt so overwhelmed since my mom died in September, doing my best to plan her memorial, act as the executive for her estate, grieve, sell her home by myself, and attempt to cope with enormous changes in my own life. And more often than not, I'm left feeling inept, overwhelmed, and so exhausted, and like I'm not at all doing what I need to be. This week helped me to accept that I'm actually doing a whole lot while grieving. Yes, there's these words again, and that means something. Thank you so much for this. Yes, and what's crazy is that we don't give grief the credit it deserves, and we can get into this a little bit here, but next week is all about humanizing grief and acknowledging that it's a living thing right alongside us. But because we see other people upright and somehow functioning in the aftermath of loss, whether they're 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years out, we're thinking, why can't I just get there? Like there's a confusion of okay, they seem to be fine. I don't know what's missing here for me. But for the most part, the people that you know, unless you've lost the same person, are not um, acutely grieving. They're not within these first stages of it, and or their loss, if they've had one, was not sudden, unexpected, traumatic, or life changing in the way that yours was, and or they're just not talking about it, which is probably really the case when people in the life after loss, and you look at them and you're like, oh my God, you're fine, because they're not physically disrupted in any way, but you don't know how hard their brain is working for them to write a check. You don't know how hard they're trying to focus on what direction they're driving on the road so they don't miss their exit. You don't know how hard they tried to lay out their clothes the night before so they would remember what to wear the next day because they don't remember how they used to dress. Like, we're also good at putting on these fronts of who we are in the aftermath of loss that we forget just about everybody else around us is grieving. Yeah, absolutely. And so we look around and we think we are. I love these words that you used, Aaron. Inept, overwhelmed, not who I'm supposed to be. But then when you acknowledge the power of grief, that this literally changes how your brain works, how your body moves, your emotions, and even the words that people say, after my dad had brain aneurysms, I could not handle anybody saying the words brain aneurysm, surgery, or even dad for about 2 years. And every time they did, no matter the context of the conversation, whether it was a professor talking about brain chemistry or a show on TV or somebody talking about their father back home, I would immediately jump back to my dad's going to die, even though he had come out of surgery like 2.5 years prior. And so these things, they permanently affect our brains and our brain chemistry as to what we're triggered by. And consequently, because of that, they affect who we are going into the future. Um, let's see. Tammy says, but when that falls apart, our identity kind of gets erased and we have to rebuild it. But now it contains the messy, sad, icky, painful chapter. And maybe we feel like it doesn't look as pretty as it used to. I know I find it hard sometimes to divulge the messy parts when people are inquiring about my past. Yeah, absolutely. And Tammy, you kind of stumbled on this thing of there's this I don't know how to describe this. Okay, people often do this with grieving people or people that they've lost. There's a temptation when somebody dies to only show the highlight reel of their life. The grief recovery method would call it like sanctifying your loved ones or martyrizing them in the aftermath of loss. And there's even a societal, westernized society perception of don't speak ill of the dead. And it's very taboo to remember that the people who died were also human. Some people have been abusers. Some parents have been our very first bullies as children. They told us when we were not enough. Some people, like in the case of my mother not accepting my sexuality before she died when we were in the middle of a fight. And so for me to bring that up is not always appropriate in polite company. And we forget that the people who died in our lives were also human. In the same way, we forget that our old selves were also human. And so our old selves had struggles and challenges and things that they were trying to figure out and things that were sad, icky, gross, not pretty to look at. But in comparison, here's the yardstick again, in comparison to the enormity of grief, it was like, oh, all of that seemed like cherries, sunshine, and roses in the life before. And so there's this temptation to see our life before, our old self, as doing really well, as the perfect life, as the picture of everything that I want to go back to. And yeah, most of us would go back to our old life in an instant if we could. But the reality is that it's just not possible. And there's such a temptation that people have to look at their old life and see and remember only the good things. Because frankly, it was a lot easier, quote unquote, back then, mostly because it was predictable. We knew what was coming. We thought we had control over our lives. We were creating our realities. And then loss rolled through, and all of a sudden it was like we were rendered absolutely powerless in the middle of it. Kim says, yes, Tammy, me too. And Tammy says, exactly. Yes, I love hearing that from you. So I'm glad we're landing on these things together. And this is something that just comes up so often in grief because we really, in this moment of embrace the new you, there's this temptation of if I'm embracing the new you, I'm discarding the old you. If I'm embracing my new self, I have to put my old self in the trash. And that's not true either. I think a lot of people think that when you step into your life after loss, you cease to remember, you cease to reflect on, you cease to live in the life that your old self lived. And that's not true. What happens is that And this is why I use the word embrace as opposed to any other word like welcome or love or attend to or whatever it is because in embracing your new self is made up of your old self and the things that they knew. And so it's like your arms can stretch out wider and include both. So in my left arm, I get to embrace my old self and my old life and everything that literally propelled me to the place where my mother died. And in this arm, I get my new self and all of the things that have come in the aftermath as a result of her death. And I get to remember and see and really acknowledge the enormity that is my life, all of the things that I'm made up of. So I'm not asking you to embrace the new self and discard the old self because that's really painful. That's like saying, this never happened. I never lived this way. You are dead to me, literally, but to ourselves. But when we embrace the new self, there's also an invitation to incorporate the old self because she's very smart. She knew a lot of things. She had a lot of life experience and she was intensely motivated. And I'm speaking for myself, but you know what your skill sets were. You know what you learned in life before loss, whether it was really big or really small, how to scramble an egg or how to do your taxes, like whatever it is, that person knows a lot of things. And you can still consult the spirit of your old self with ways to help you deal with this person that is your new self. Like you don't have to exclude your old self because the new self has come along. That being said, the new self does take up a lot of your time, energy, money, uh, love, attention, all of these other things because it is so new. It is so new. Ha! Yes, Tammy, have you noticed that though that people will sometimes slowly back away when they know about the messy parts? It's almost like you said you have a disease and it might be contagious. Yeah. Um, that's true. Melissa says, Tammy, people do not have to have the conversation of grief, and yet all of us experience it. Yeah, people do not like to have the conversation of grief, and yet all of us experience it. And Tammy, I think what you're witnessing here is the taboo or the shame that can sometimes come with grief and loss, as if I see this especially with widows and divorced people when I take them on as clients, is all of my friends, my female friends, have disappeared. Or none of my friends will hang out with me anymore. They're all married, and I think they're afraid of catching what I have. And there's very much this, pardon me, this element of this is contagious somehow. All of these bad things happen to you, so maybe now they'll happen to me. And it's almost for people like they're getting closer than they want to be to grief and loss. I think a lot of people are comfy keeping grief and loss at an arm's distance, and that's all good and well until it happens to them. And depending on your friendship with this person, Tammy, or this group of people, you can reach out and say something like, "Hey, I noticed you kind of backing away when I was sharing something really vulnerable about my life, or the ways in which I'm not perfect, or kind of the dark side of what I've been going through lately." You choose your insert script here. Um, I was wondering what you thought about that, or that kind of hurt, and I'm wondering if I'm seeing the situation truthfully, as like how am I understanding what you're putting out into the universe correctly, or is it misconstrued? Because it might not be so for them. It might be a case of you're talking about how you suddenly lost your job, and it reminds them of how they lost their job 10 years ago and they weren't ready to think about that today. So you may have inadvertently triggered them and just don't know it. But more than likely, Melissa said it correctly, people don't like to have the conversation of grief and loss. Not everybody is an appropriate container for receiving those dark, icky, messy sides. And I think a lot of people have different protection mechanisms for that, of shutting it out, whether it's physically backing away. I'm wheeling away in my chair right now. Whether it's, redirecting conversation to things that are more fun, quote unquote, to talk about, heavy air quotes here, or just disappearing altogether. It really does depend. And the way they react says nothing about you. It says everything about what they were taught about grief and loss. It says nothing about you or the things that you're bringing to the table. It says what they believe to be true about grief and loss. So if they believe that if something bad happens to you, so it's going to happen to them, that is not your problem. It's painful, yes, but it is not your problem. And I invite you, if they are a close friend of yours or a close family member or somebody that you've known for a long time, hey, I kind of felt you stepping away last time in our conversation when I was revealing something hard about my life. I'm wondering if I'm seeing that correctly, or if you had something else going on, is a really good way to approach them in that. And that's a great way to embrace your new self as well, because you're not asking your new self to go away so you can be in other people's company. I think there's this temptation, Tammy, of, well, they backed away last time I told them about, you know, my marriage falling apart, and so I just won't bring that up again. And that dishonors your new self to not tell the whole truth or to not be perfectly honest with people. And so instead of covering that, inquire as to why people backed away. And if they say something like, I just can't hear you tell stories like that, I'm afraid I'm going to catch it, kind of whatever shit that falls out of their mouth that's inappropriate, that person is not a proper friend for you. And again, we'll bring in these words right now for this moment at this time. Doesn't mean you can't pursue something with them in the future. It means right now they are not an appropriate container for your grief. And that also means you can dive into spaces like this one, like public grief support groups, perhaps ones at your church, synagogue, kind of wherever you are, where people are trained to hold space for your grief and hear about the messy stuff. There are entire pockets of people, especially, with the emergence of online groups and stories and things like that, where you can share your story free from judgment. I'll actually share the 3 that I'm in here today for you. There's one called The Terrible Club, and it's related to the podcast TTFA, which is Terrible, Thanks for Asking. It's a grief-based podcast that's all about the ways in which our lives can be terrible. And so some people have had instances where they've died, they've had natural disasters roll through, they were born with some kind of defect or impediment. Sometimes people were witnesses or actually victims in mass shootings. It's a beautifully told storytelling podcast from a public radio station, and there's this whole club on Facebook called the TTFA Terrible Club, and it's a bunch of people who are grieving, dealing with hard things in their lives, and every day, multiple times a day, there are people posting in there about their shit and really what life looks like right now. And the answer always is, how am I? Terrible. Thanks for asking. And it's a place where that's more than okay and really acceptable. The other one that I'm in right now is the Modern Loss Patreon group, and you do have to pledge to support Modern Loss on Patreon to be a part of the group, but it's made for 20 and 30 somethings, but really anybody who's lost somebody to death. It's a more specific group, and every single day people are in there sharing photos, sharing stories, sharing memories, and also saying, my cousin's being an asshole this week, my stepmom's not the same person that she used to be. I have friends in college who stopped talking to me because my dad died, or whatever the things they are. And that's been really helpful to me. And then, of course, most of you are members of the Grief Growers Garden as well, which is where people share what's really going on with them, their rituals, the memories, the photos, the stories, and the ways in which people in their lives are backing away. And it's painful. Yeah. So I wonder if that might be more helpful to you. Melissa, I always say when people see me, it reminds them of their children's mortality. Tammy says, yes, I can totally see how that could be. Yeah. And this might be why I'm so kind of talk about an opposite protective mechanism. It's why I'm so insistent about telling people about my loss within the first 5 sentences of meeting them. And it's not necessarily a strict rule per se, but especially when I'm dating, when I'm applying for a job, when I'm entering into a relationship that I know might last me a while, I drop the bomb of my mother's death and that I've survived that. Interviewing roommates, going into community organizations, whatever it is. If I think I'm going to be there for a while, I drop the bomb of my mother's death. I'm like, I am somebody who lost her mom when I was 21. My mom died when I was young. Part of that's because I do grief work, and so this is a part of my identity. But also when I'm introducing myself to new people for the first time, I'm like, if you can't handle it, this is your chance to step away, to back out, to tell me I'm crazy, to tell me that it's too much, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's almost like, here's the door, I'm giving you an out. If you would like it, you're free to take it. But I'm starting here, and if you don't like it, then that's on you, because I know what kind of person I am and how I show up to spaces. And yeah, sometimes it is ugly, gross, messy, unattractive, unpretty. And if they can't handle that, if they want to live in a world where everything is perfect and nothing bad ever happens, then we cannot speak to each other. We are not a good fit. And so it's trying to put a puzzle piece in a place where it doesn't go. I'm actually working on a blog post that I'm going to publish later this year that says, if you've never grieved, we probably can't be friends. And it's an unfortunate reality of life after loss, is that a lot of people, especially if they've never grieved or if they haven't grieved yet, even if they have lost, they just haven't grieved in the aftermath of that loss, they're still propelling on like everything is fine. We cannot be friends. So if people have never had any sort of bad thing happen to them, I'm like, we can't, we're not speaking the same language and you don't know what this is like when your whole world implodes. I need somebody who knows what this is like. Goes beyond romantic relationships. This goes to friends also. Um, and even people who are continuing to plow through their loss as if nothing has happened. I'm like, we cannot be friends. Not deep, not lasting friends anyway, because friendship for me, relationships for me, even work with coworkers for me is about really seeing all of who people are and taking that humanity into the experience. And there are pockets of people all over the world that also believe these things. And I know they may not be your closest circle of friends or even the people you expected to be there on behalf of your new self, but they do exist and they're out there in the world. Let's see. Tammy says, yes, Shelby, I've made a conscious choice not to share with certain people who can't handle it, and seeing that now is gained wisdom. Yeah, and it's like a really sad, and this is a way that you can embrace the new you, because it's like, honey, I'm not going to let you show up anywhere where people aren't going to appreciate you. Baby, I understand that you've suffered a lot, and I'm not going to put you in a place where I need to ask you to hide or where you're going to feel unsafe. And so there's an embracing that happens when we talk to ourselves like this, our new self. Because in the past, that was something we never worried about. We never had a loss story that steamrolled other people into running away from us. But now we do. And so there's almost this reassessing of not only our new selves, but their family, friendship networks, community, workplace, etc., etc. Are these places welcoming of who I am now? And that is a major part of embracing your new self. Yes. Kim says it's compounding the hurt, losing our friends because they just can't handle the reality of loss and pain. We have lost the art of suffering. Yes, we absolutely have. I believe there's a book by that name, The Art of Suffering. But the one I'm thinking about right now that I'd like to recommend is, I think it's called The Art of Compassion or something like that. It's written by this woman who was in hospice care for quite a long time, and it's about how to hold space for other people. But yes, Kim, you're hitting the nail on the head. This is the book that I'm working on right now, about how our friends disappear in the aftermath of loss because they just can't handle it, or they say really shitty things to us, or they try and make us eat herbs or try yoga, or all these other things to cover up grief and loss because they don't know how to reckon with, accept, understand the person that we are now. And this is not a book for friends supporting those who are grieving. This is a book for grieving people whose friends have run away, and how to start those conversations and decide if you want to keep the friendship, assess the friendship further, and see if there's going to be continued holes and weaknesses in it, or ditch the friendship for now, right now, altogether. And so it's a really phenomenal book in progress where there's these different kinds of people, different kinds of monsters that our friends can become in response to who we've become in the aftermath of loss. And it is this book about how we experience loss, but then we additionally experience the loss of our friends. And so it's like the loss compounds and adds on top of itself. And we're just sitting here feeling more isolated than we ever have before, because people that we thought would be there for us and we thought would get it cannot, or do not, or will not. They're choosing not to. And that really, really hurts. Kim says, part of my compassion for myself problem is that I, my old self, bought into the lie that I should be able to, triumph over whatever suffering would come my way. Yeah, and this kind of goes back to what Mike was saying when we talked about week 6, Say Goodbye to the Perfect Griever. I always thought the good guys would win, and sometimes the good guys can be us also. And I think, Kim, in this, there's a couple things that need to happen is how do you define triumph? Because it's a nice thing to think about, is that I'm going to triumph over whatever comes my way, but what does triumph look like to you? Does it look like survival? Does it look like powering through? Does it look like conquering? Does it look like, really break down what is a triumphed person and what do they look like? And you might find that your new self is a lot closer to that than you think, in the sense that you've triumphed over whatever came your way, but not in the way that you expected. And so, like, kind of shifting 2 degrees that picture of what triumph looks like. And or, however, there is this false story, and I think this is what you're really getting at here. Is there's a false story that we tell ourselves in our old lives that we can handle anything that comes our way. And then loss happens and we can't handle it anymore. But the real story of that is the person that we were before loss can't handle it. The new self, that the person we are after loss, is learning how to handle it. And that is a major distinction that needs to be made right here and right now. And this is so much of why releasing the old self letting that fade into the background, still in the embrace, but fading into the background is okay because the old self did not know a life with loss. They've never seen a life with loss. They've never understood, comprehended, had to live through a life with loss. And that's where the new self comes in, steps in, and takes over, saying, I don't understand this, but I know that I'm going to be the person that gets you through it. And so it's not necessarily shifting the narrative of the old self could triumph over anything that came their way, and then loss happened and they couldn't. So the new self is going to triumph over anything that comes their way. It's like the new self is going to learn how to. And so there's a softness there. I'm getting chills saying this. Um, there's a softness there in allowing our new self time to learn, time to acclimate, adjust, comprehend, understand, um, be sent spinning, and then slowly come back to center. The image I'm getting right now is of like if you've this is old school, but if you've ever played with one of those tops that you twist onto the ground, like especially those metal ones, and they go in these huge wide circles, then finally they come to a point and they're like this. It's like in the aftermath of loss, we're spinning around in these huge circles, and then finally we're like, okay, here's the new center. We're understanding where that new center is in the world. But at first we're like, I don't know where I am. This is all brand new. I don't understand any of this. This has never looked like anything I've comprehended before. And the whole time we remember what our old self was like. And we're like, why can't I just go back to that? And it's because our old self does not know what loss looked like. They never lived in a world with loss before. And so they can't even comprehend how to survive when spinning out of control. But the place where embracing the new you comes in is where we allow ourselves grace to learn what triumphing looks like in the new life, because it may not look like what it used to look like for our old self. There's this picture of, I get the shield and the sword and like conquering like the knight. I'm literally just picking up in my chair like, I have conquered this, I have triumphed over it. And yeah, we probably triumphed over and conquered a lot of things in our old life, but they were still kind of under this umbrella of predictability. We knew it was going to happen. There were things that were under our control. It affected one aspect of our life, but not the whole entirety of our lives, et cetera, et cetera. And so we knew what we were looking at. And then loss comes through, and it's this huge entity that's completely unknown. I know, Betty, in the past, you've spoken about one of the worst things about loss is that it's just a big ball of unknowns. And then to live life in the aftermath of loss, we can try to triumph over it, but like it takes time to get acclimated to the fact that you're living a life after loss at all. So it's like we could try and triumph, but what if we started by learning how to, or learning what that looks like for us now? Um, absolutely. Yes, Kim says accepting my new self and forgiving my old self for believing and even perpetuating that lie. And you know what? It might not even be as harsh as a lie. It might be a myth. It might be an old story. It might be something, a belief that served you and now no longer serves you. It doesn't make sense anymore. Kind of like when you outgrow clothes or toys and they're just not appropriate for you in your life anymore. And so you're like, I got to pick up some new ones. And so even soften the blow of, this was a lie, I was a liar, I lied to myself, I fell into the trap, because that, even that language can appear harsh to us. And our new self is sitting here like, why are you attacking me? It doesn't make any sense as to why I'm being berated for not knowing how to do this. And our old self is also like, why are you attacking me? I was just doing the best I knew how at the time. I believed in the things that I thought were true in the world. Like Mike said, I believed the good guys would always win. And so why did you ever believe that the good guys could always win? And he's like, that's what everybody else believed. That's what I was taught. That's what I saw in the movies and on TV. Like, how was I supposed to know anything different? And so there's so much room for grace and forgiveness here. Yeah. One of my favorite authors, Gretchen Rubin, talks about how we can respect ourselves and also expect more from ourselves. And so respecting exactly who we were, exactly who we are, and still have this vision that's looking towards the future of expecting more of ourselves eventually, later, not right now, once we've gotten the groundwork laid. And I hope that's helpful to you, because that's something that even now gives me chills, and lets me be in this place of, and I rarely talk about this, grief growers. It's something I'm still kind of working through, both with professionals and with myself. But I struggled and continue to struggle with massive disordered eating as a result of my loss. And so when I get into these moments in these places, even in my new self where I want to binge eat because I cannot handle my feelings, I cannot handle my emotions as they are right now, I accept that girl who went through so much massive trauma that she felt like the only way to feel good in life was to eat. And also, I expect more from myself in the sense of if I'm going to eat, I'm not going to eat as much as I used to. Or if I'm going to eat, I'm not going to eat the same things that I used to. And so I'm trying to change it up in these little small ways as I get acclimated to a life where I feel safe enough and comforted enough and nurtured enough to where I don't need food to fill that massive hole. And that's a huge area of growth that's still happening in my life, where some days I'm like, I really respect who I am, I love who I am, I'm embracing myself, and then a binge happens and I wake up the next morning and I'm like, wow, I can't believe I'm still here. I can't believe I'm still this broken, is the story that I tell myself. Why can't I go back to my old self before I even knew what an eating disorder was? And there's this shame and regret and almost like this agony of why can't I get back there, or why can't I be so far into the future that I'm healed from this? And there's this image of like being on the swinging bridge. I'm still in the suspended state of loss happened, which is the start, and then learning to navigate life after loss as a person who permanently has a changed relationship with food and love and comfort, and how all those three things are related. Yeah, absolutely. Um, Tammy, what I have found since my big losses go back a few years now is that people who are experiencing loss, challenges, and sadness for the first time will come to me now because they're trying to understand their own journey and they know I've kind of come out on the other side. Now I feel a little bit more like a warrior with some major battle scars, but I'm still standing. And that helps me appreciate and hold sacred the hard parts of my life. Yes. And I will say there's this quote, I don't remember who it's by. So if you know, please come in and leave a comment of we are all just walking each other home. And even in the first months and years of losing my mom, I would look for people who also lost people, but like 2 years ahead of me, or 5 years ahead of me. Not too far, because if you go too far, at some point in the grief space, I kind of marked it around 17 or 18 years, people start only telling the triumph story and stop telling the pain story. And if that's where they are, that's perfectly fine, but I can't live there yet. And so I try and go 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years ahead of where I am in my loss right now. And I'm like, okay, I can hope for that. I don't know how it's possible, but I can hope for that. And I would talk to my new self. I'd be like, you see that? That's where we're aiming. We don't know how to get there yet, do we? But we're going to get there eventually. And even not quite that, but something that looks like that, something that feels like that. But for me, for us, new self and me together in this journey, is like seeing these other people, not necessarily as role models, but as these influences and proof. We talk about building the case for our new selves and embracing our new self. You're not the only one who's accomplishing things and doing things while grieving. There are a lot of other people you can add to the list. And I think I talked about this while doing the social media cleanse in the last part of week 8 of Life After Loss Academy, is surrounding yourself with people who are also on this road, but maybe just in a different place from you. So I notice a lot of times in my grief work, I can't follow and look at people's accounts who are newly grieving for the most part, because I'm like, wow, there's so much pain and hurt and ache there that as a goal, I can't look there. I can be there as companionship, solace, understanding. Absolutely, I remember living in that world. But the people I quote unquote aspire to be are the ones that are 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10 years out from their loss from me, and they've turned their grief into something different, or their relationship with grief has changed. And I'm actually starting to talk about what we're going to talk about next week in week 9, which is humanize your grief and seeing grief as a long-term relationship. So that's coming, and I love that we're tilting into this space. We're getting there into picturing grief as a long-term relationship. Yeah. um Aaron says, I love this, Tammy. Battle scars. Yes. Yeah. Oh, Betty, Ram Dass, thank you. And I'm so sad that he actually recently passed away as well, I believe within the last month or so. He was a pioneer in the world of um, psychotropic drugs, things like LSD, for unlocking and healing trauma. And then people kind of kicked him out of the research studies because they were giving people drugs to see what would happen, like shrooms and stuff. And then he became like this enlightened spiritual dude. He like went away and came back and changed his name to Ram Dass. He's a very fascinating story. If you ever get the chance to look up him and his life, his interview with Oprah is one of the craziest things I've ever heard. Yes. Aaron says, I love that you asked us to identify our grief role models a while back, Shelby, because of what you're saying now. It's so helpful to have that reminder that others have survived and thrived somehow. Yes. And this is also something I talked about when I was in conversation with Rob Bell, because even in the aftermath of my loss, I would see people who survived, and I knew they survived. I'm like, I logically understand that you got through it, but there was something else about them that I couldn't put my finger on at the time, but now I know it to be they did this thing that we're talking about doing right now. They took the old self and the new self and embraced them both and went into the future, really expanding their pictures of themselves to here, as opposed to old self, new self. This dies, this lives. Instead of, I am holding both of these people, both of these lives, all of this information in one person at one time. And so I said to Rob Bell, I was like, it's like they expanded the spectrum of humanness to here. And so you have all these human experiences once you experience loss, and you don't stop taking yourself with you. You come with yourself in the aftermath of loss. And I would see these people in the grief space. I was like, oh, you took yourself with you. Because there's something toxic when grieving people say, uh, I ditched my old life. I became a new, better self. Um, I triumphed over this. I conquered grief. I battled long and hard and I came out on top. Like those narratives are, I killed my old life. I forgot about my old life. I don't remember who I was. And I don't want to think about my life before because grief made me a better person. And I'm like, I don't subscribe to that. But then conversely, I found these new people to follow who were like, grief totally changed my life. It forced me to become someone different. And this is what I've done since then. Or grief came in, it totally shattered who I was and everything I knew to be true, and this is the person I've made in the aftermath. And so there were these different, gentler stories that were not dissing grief, dissing our old selves, like packing all that up in a box and putting it up in the attic where we'd forget about it. But it was like all of this happened, and there's a new person here that I'm learning to love, know, embrace, understand, comprehend, reckon with in the aftermath of loss. And so something different happens there when we let our old self exist alongside our new self and not try and pit them against each other as like red versus blue, old self, new self, somebody has to win. The new self regrets that the old self doesn't exist. The old self hates the new self for taking over. Like, it's not that. It's something that's very, like, embracing the new self is about making our arm span wider as opposed to putting something down and picking something else up, which I think is what a lot of people think happens after loss is you put your old self down and pick up your new self. But in reality, it's this. We're making room for the experience that our loss has dropped into our lives. Um, Kim says, I feel like ditching the old life actually dishonors the loss and the whole reason and love that made it a loss in the first place. And yeah, that's really absolutely true. Is that ditching the old life dishonors the fact that loss happened at all. Because God knows loss would not be so painful if we didn't have that history, that person, those memories, those ideas, those hopes, dreams, expectations. And so without the person that the old self was, the new self would not exist. And even then, there is appreciation and embracing of the new self there. Because it's like, wow, you wouldn't even be here if I didn't give so much of a shit back then. If I didn't care so much, if I didn't love so much, if I didn't want so much, if I didn't hope so much, if none of that was true, you wouldn't even exist right now. And that's really, really cool to say for ourselves because it's like, I'm so glad you exist because the fact a new self exists means our old self existed. I don't know if that's making sense, but yes, 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 yes. You've landed on something that's so cool here is that this would not even be real if the old self did not love so hard, engage so hard, invest so hard, just be so present and be so open and willing and magnificent is the word that's coming to me right now. Tammy says, I like that, Shelby, just making our arm span wider. And I do too. And this is not always how I thought about grief. And you'll find out a bit more about that next week when I talk about humanizing grief. But for so, so long, I thought I had to fight grief, as in, like, push it back, push it away, make it an enemy, cure it, fix it, pretty it up, stuff it down in the basement. You guys know my book, Permission to Grieve, talks a lot about the wolf in the basement. But when I stopped doing this and started doing this, it was like something unlocked inside of me. It was like I saw grief and my old self and my loss and my new life differently because all of a sudden they were connected to each other. They weren't things I had to resist or get rid of or throw away. They could all stay. And that's a revolutionary idea. This space that we're in right now is a revolution to say you can keep your old life, you can remember and honor and memorialize your loss, and you can embrace your new self. Guys, like, how cool is that? This is not what the world teaches to be true about loss, and yet it is entirely possible. Not just because I'm doing it actively right now, but because others have done it and others have been doing it for years and years and years and years and years. This is just me putting it into my words in this video call in this course today. But this has been a way that people have dealt with loss for years and years and years. And it's only recently that our westernized society has really isolated and quarantined grief. And in reality, we become so much bigger, wider, better human people when we allow all of these things to exist simultaneously, when we allow ourselves the bandwidth, the energy, the money, the focus, the attention, the love, the compassion to hold all of them together instead of trying to, I'm thinking like forklift in an Amazon warehouse, kind of quarantine things into their little cubbies and holes. I'm like, what if all of it was connected? What if we were all walking each other home? What if all the parts of ourselves were just walking each other home? What if our new self was walking our old self home and vice versa? Yeah, yeah. Kate says, all of this makes so much sense and is so helpful. Thank you, Shelby, and everyone here for participating in this. Yeah, and I'll say we've hit the hour mark, so I want to say a huge, tremendous, oh my God, thank you to everyone for shifting to YouTube today. I will let this video buffer after I close it and then post the replay in our private Facebook groups. You always have access to it, and this is a private link exclusively for us, so I would appreciate it if you didn't share it anywhere else. Part of it's because it wouldn't make sense to anybody else either. They would have had to have been here for 8 weeks. But I am just massively seeing all of you right now. There's a wrestling that happens when the new self comes in because it's like stranger has entered the home. And now we're like, okay, looking to understand the stranger, looking to comprehend the stranger, looking to acclimate to the spinning top new world that is life after loss so we can slowly find our center and be able to embrace the old self and the new self together. I will say a huge hearty stay tuned for next week, week 9, which is called Humanize Your Grief. This might be my favorite lesson in all of Life After Loss Academy because there's a lot of visual components here. But see what you think. I'm excited to let you know. And of course, that is coming out on Monday, not Wednesday. So February 24th, look for that live on Thinkific. I have it set to post then. I am so incredibly honored to know all of you here in Life After Loss Academy, and I hope this course is really changing how you see life after loss. I see you. I am so incredibly proud of you and the work that you're doing in the world, my beautiful grief growers, because even through grief, we are growing. Oh, and I love you too. I forgot to say I love you. I always love you because even through grief, we are growing.